Welcome back to the week 33 of the Book of Mormon Come Follow Me program. Boy, do I have a story for you this week. If you like action, drama, intrigue, and betrayal, this is the week you've been waiting for. We've been stuck in the year 74 BC for a while now. That's the 18th year of the reign of the judges. There's been a lot going on, and it appears that there's a lot more that is going to transpire. More characters are going to enter the story here. We're not through with Alma and his sons just yet, but they're going to be joined by some of the other great men of the Book of Mormon who will occupy the rest of the Book of Alma. And by the way, I need to make a correction before we go on. 2 weeks ago, I said that Alma's son Helaman would be the subject of the next book, the Book of Helaman. I was incorrect in that. That Helaman is the son of Helaman, the grandson of Alma. Anyway, on we go. As we begin chapter 43 of Alma, we see that Alma's sons, all of his sons, including Corianton, went forth to the Zoramites to continue their work. Verse 1 of chapter 43 adds this, "And Alma also himself could not rest, and he also went forth." And then we get one last comment on them for a little while. It says this, "Now we shall say no more concerning their preaching, except that they preached the word and the truth according to the spirit of prophecy and revelation, and they preached after the holy order of God, by which they were called." Don't worry, it's not the last time we will hear about them, but we're going to get back to the wars and the strife between the Nephites and the Lamanites. We're still in the 18th year of the reign of Judges, and there is a lot happening. As we begin, the Zoramites who were not converted by Alma and his sons became Lamanites and thus enemies to the Nephites. This combined Lamanite and Zoramite army prepared to advance on the Nephite lands. But the Nephites learned of their preparations, so they had a little time to prepare themselves. Remember, the land of Jershon was between the land of Nephi, that's the home of the Lamanites, and the land of Zarahemla. So the Nephite army took up positions and defenses there, in Jershon. The Zoramites lived in the land of Antionum, and their leader was a man named Zarahemna. The Lamanite army was composed of the Lamanites from the land of Nephi and the Zoramites from the land of Antionum, and also the Amalekites, those Nephite dissenters from about 90 BC who were after the order of Nahor. Verse 6 says that the Amalekites were the more wicked part of the Lamanite army. The Zoramites were the next most wicked. So Zarahemna drew from those two groups to lead the platoons of his army. And verse 8 says, "For behold, his designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites. This he did that he might usurp power over them, and also that he might gain great power over the Nephites by bringing them into bondage." And speaking of the Nephites, yea, and they also knew the extreme hatred of the Lamanites toward their brethren, who were the people of anti-Nephi Lehi, who were called the people of Ammon, and they would not take up arms. Yea, they had entered into a covenant, and they would not break it. Therefore, if they should fall into the hands of the Lamanites, they would be destroyed. The one advantage the people of Ammon had was that the Zoramites, who were converted by Alma and his sons, joined with them, and they had not made the covenant to fight, so they were at least able to help somewhat. But still, the battle was not going to be won without the armies of the Nephites, and the Nephites understood these circumstances well. So we read, And the people of Ammon did give unto the Nephites a large portion of their substance to support their armies, and thus the Nephites were compelled alone to withstand against the Lamanites, who were a compound of Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael, and all those who had dissented from the Nephites, who were Amalekites and Zoramites, and the descendants of the priests of Noah. Now those descendants were as numerous nearly as the Nephites, and thus the Nephites were obliged to contend with their brethren, even unto bloodshed. And it came to pass, as the armies of the Lamanites had gathered in the land of Antionum, behold, the armies of the Nephites were prepared to meet them in the land of Jershon. And here we get to meet another great Book of Mormon hero. He was the leader of the Nephite army, and his name was Moroni. He must have been an extraordinary man and a leader, because verse 17 says, "And Moroni took all the command and the government of their wars, and he was only 25 years old when he was appointed chief captain over the armies of the Nephites." Now this first battle of many to come was short-lived, and so we read, "And it came to pass that he," that's Moroni, "met the Lamanites in the borders of Jershon, and his people were armed with swords and with scimitars, and with all manner of weapons of war. And when the armies of the Lamanites saw that the people of Nephi, or that Moroni, had prepared his people with breastplates and with arm shields, yea, and also shields to defend their heads, and also they were dressed with thick clothing. Now the army of Zarahemnah was not prepared with any such thing. They had only their swords and their scimitars, and their stones and their slings, and they were naked, save it were skin which was girded about their loins. Yea, all were naked, save it were the Zoramites and the Amalekites. But they were not armed with breastplates nor shields. Therefore they were exceedingly afraid of the Nephites because of their armor, notwithstanding their number being so much greater than the Nephites. Now it came to pass that they durst not come upon the Nephites in the borders of Jershon. Therefore they departed out of the land of Antionum into the wilderness, and took their journey round about in the wilderness, away from the head of the river Sidon." In other words, they chickened out when they saw Moroni's preparations. But the story's not over. In fact, it's just beginning, and it gets much more complex. Rather than just quote scriptures to you, I think I will try to summarize this first section to make it a little easier to follow. So as we read, the Lamanite army, seeing the vast preparations of the Nephites, turned tail and ran, thinking they would find refuge in the wilderness. But they also wanted to make their way towards the land of Manti, thinking they would not meet any resistance there. However, Moroni, being a brilliant tactician, sent spies to learn their plans. He left part of his army to protect Jershon, believing the Lamanites would pose little threat there now, and sent the rest of his army and headed for Manti to meet them head on. Well, not only head on, Moroni had a clever strategy. First, he enlisted the people of Manti to make preparations for their own defense. Next, it says, he secreted his army in a valley near the west side of the river Sidon. There, after learning a little bit more about the Lamanite plans, he divided his army and sent part of them to the east, near a hill called Riplah. So we have the citizens of Manti preparing to meet the Lamanites on their own turf. We have some of Moroni's army hidden in a valley on the west side of the river Sidon, and another part hidden near a hill called Riplah. They were well placed. So when the Lamanite army came marching towards the land of Manti, as they passed the hill Riplah on the north side, Lehi, commander of the army hidden behind the hill Riplah, came from the east side and encircled them about, coming from behind them. And when the Lamanites saw that, they turned around and began to contend with them. This turned out to be a bloody battle, but more so for the Lamanites than Lehi's army. Let's read here. "And the work of death commenced on both sides, but it was more dreadful on the part of the Lamanites, for their nakedness was exposed to the heavy blows of the Nephites with their swords and their scimitars, which brought death almost at every stroke. While on the other hand, there was now and then a man fell among the Nephites by their sword in the loss of blood, they being shielded from the more vital parts of the body, or the more vital parts of the body being shielded from the strokes of the Lamanites by their breastplates and their arm shields and their headplates. And thus the Nephites did carry on the work of death among the Lamanites. Well, you can imagine how this was going for Zarahemnah and his army. They could see right away that this was going very badly, so they made the decision to turn and run. They headed for the river, but Lehi's men followed after them, and it says, and they were pursued by Lehi and his men, and they were driven by Lehi into the waters of Sidon, and they crossed the waters of Sidon, and Lehi retained his armies upon the bank of the river Sidon, that they should not cross. I think Zarahemnah thought he and his men were safe now, but that was not the case. Remember, Moroni's men were hiding and waiting in the valley next to the river. And so we read, and it came to pass that Moroni and his army met the Lamanites in the valley on the other side of the river Sidon, and began to fall upon them and to slay them. And the Lamanites did flee again before them toward the land of Manti, and they were met again by the armies of Moroni. So, fighting for their lives now, with no way out, the Lamanites fought with an increased energy and fury. The scriptures say they fought like dragons, and in this battle many Nephites were killed, along with many Lamanites. But we read that the number of the Lamanites was more than double that of the Nephites. The Lamanites were driven by the fear for their lives and their hatred of the Nephites, but the Nephites were fighting for much more. We are told that they were inspired by a better cause. They were fighting not for monarchy nor power, but for their wives and their children, and their right to worship their God as they desired. And as they were not the aggressors here, they had the blessings of the Lord on their side. In verse 47, Mormon tells us, and again the Lord has said that ye shall defend your families even unto bloodshed. Therefore, for this cause were the Nephites contending with the Lamanites, to defend themselves and their families and their lands and their country and their rights and their religion. Moroni's army drove the Lamanites and herded them into one body in that valley on the banks of the Sidon. And then we read, therefore the armies of Moroni encircled them about, yea, even on both sides of the river. For behold, on the east were the men of Lehi. They were trapped, and it says when they realized this, they were struck with terror. Now Moroni, being an honorable man, when he saw their terror, he commanded his men to cease their fighting. It was time for negotiations and diplomacy now. Moroni addresses Zarahemnah, and he says, ye know that ye are in our hands, yet we do not desire to slay you. Behold, we have not come out to battle against you that we might shed your blood for power, neither do we desire to bring anyone to the yoke of bondage. And then Moroni makes Zarahemnah a fair offer. He says, I command you by all the desires that ye have for life, that ye deliver up your weapons of war unto us, and we will seek not your blood, but we will spare your lives, if you will go your way and not come to war against us. That sure seems like a fair deal to me. Moroni made it clear that the alternative was death for all of them. So it seems clear that there was really only one option for Zarahemnah. Well, he was a negotiator also, so he proposed a compromise. Moroni had wanted them to make a covenant with the Nephites that they would not come against them again. And Zarahemnah's response was, we will give up our arms and we will go our way, but we will not make an oath with you, quote, which we know that we shall break. Otherwise, we will retain our swords and we will perish or conquer. So what did Moroni do? He returned the swords he had already gathered and said, behold, we will end the conflict. Now as ye are in our hands, we will spill your blood upon the ground, or ye shall submit to the conditions which I have proposed. Zerahemnah tried to make a defiant move by raising his sword against Moroni, but one of Moroni's men knocked his sword to the ground, and he also smote Zerahemnah and scalped him, then taking the scalp and raising it high up on his own sword. As you can imagine, this had a strong effect on many of the Lamanite soldiers, and it says, "Now there were many, when they heard these words and saw the scalp which was upon the sword, they were struck with fear, and many came forth and threw down their weapons of war at the feet of Moroni, and entered into a covenant of peace. And as many as entered into a covenant, they suffered to depart into the wilderness." That seems like a prudent move, and yet there were many who stayed to fight, and another great slaughter ensued. This time, when Zerahemnah saw that it was futile to continue on, he had a change of heart. Now Zerahemnah, when he saw that they were about to be destroyed, cried mightily unto Moroni, promising that he would covenant, and also his people with them, if they would spare the remainder of their lives, that they never would come to war again against them. And so everybody went home to their wives and their children. Now you may be wondering why we are going over these wars in so much detail and so often. Well, the truth is, war was a common reality of Nephite and Lamanite life. And there are some lessons to be learned here. You will recall that the Lamanite army was at least twice as numerous as the Nephite army. And we will see this again in the coming pages of the Book of Mormon. And yet, most of the time, the Nephites prevailed. I say most of the time because there were too many times when they did not. And if you look very carefully, you will find that when the Nephites were righteous, they never lost a battle. And when they were living wickedly, they never won a battle. There'll be more about that later on. The end of chapter 44 said that that was the end of Alma's record, but there is a little bit more that you should know. First of all, the people of Ammon and the rest of the Nephites attributed their great victory over the Lamanites to God, saying, "The people of Nephi were exceedingly rejoiced because the Lord had again delivered them out of the hands of their enemies." You see, they never took credit themselves, at least while they were a righteous or a semi-righteous people. Understand, they were not perfect, but they tried, as we try, to keep the commandments as best they could, and they put their faith in the Lord. And more importantly, they recognized the Lord after the fact, when they had won. Now, during this time in this battle, we have not heard from Alma, because he was a preacher, he was a missionary, and we've been talking about Moroni and the military. But now we turn back to him one last time. This is not his record, but I think Helaman's record of what his father said to him. Alma calls his son Helaman to him to make sure that he understands the sanctity of the records that Alma has placed in his care. And then we get this, I think, very strange exchange between Alma and Helaman. And this is being recounted by Mormon, who is the only one who could even begin to understand this prophecy and give us this account. It was a prophecy kept in secret for almost 500 years, and only Mormon would see its fulfillment. Let's dig in a little bit. Alma told Helaman the following: "But behold, I have somewhat to prophesy unto thee. But what I prophesy unto thee ye shall not make known, even until the prophecy is fulfilled. Therefore write the words which I shall say." So obviously this is coming from the record that Helaman kept after getting the records from his father. He became the record keeper, and these words stayed hidden with him and all the subsequent prophets of the Book of Mormon from that time forth. So here is the prophecy as recorded by Helaman. "Behold, I perceive that this very people, the Nephites, according to the spirit of revelation which is in me, in 400 years from the time that Jesus Christ shall manifest himself unto them, shall dwindle in unbelief. Yea, and then they shall see wars and pestilences, yea, famines and bloodshed, even until the people of Nephi shall become extinct. Yea, and this because they shall dwindle in unbelief, and fall into the works of darkness, and lasciviousness, and all manner of iniquities. Yea, I say unto you, that from that day even the fourth generation shall not all pass away before this great iniquity shall come. And when that day cometh, behold, the time very soon cometh, that those who are now, or the seed of those who are now, numbered among the people of Nephi, shall no more be numbered among the people of Nephi. But whosoever remaineth and is not destroyed in that great and dreadful day shall be numbered among the Lamanites, and they shall become like unto them all, save it be a few who shall be called the disciples of the Lord. And them shall the Lamanites pursue, even until they shall become extinct. And now, because of this iniquity, this prophecy shall be fulfilled. While that prophecy was to remain hidden, when he was finished, Alma made this one public statement. He says, And now it came to pass that after Alma had said these things to Helaman, he blessed him, and also his other sons. And he also blessed the earth for righteous sake. He said, Thus saith the Lord God, Cursed shall be the land, yea, this land, unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, unto destruction, which do wickedly, when they are fully ripe. And as I have said, so shall it be. For this is the cursing and the blessing of God upon this land. For the Lord cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. And when Alma had said these words, he blessed the church, yea, and all those who should stand fast in the faith from that time henceforth. And this marked the end of Alma's story. This was within a year after he had spoken to his sons, including Corianton, in the story we heard last week. This was the end of the 18th year of the reign of Judges, and all we know about the rest of Alma's life and death comes from this one bit. It says, And when Alma had done this, he departed out of the land of Zarahemla, as if to go to the land of Melech. And it came to pass that he was never heard of more, and as to his death or burial, we know not of. Behold, this we know, that he was a righteous man, and the saying went abroad in the church that he was taken up by the Spirit, or buried by the hand of the Lord, even as Moses. But behold, the Scriptures saith, The Lord himself took Moses unto him, and we suppose that he also received Alma in the Spirit unto himself. Therefore, for this cause we know nothing concerning his death and burial. From this point on, the work fell to Helaman and Shiblon, and yes, Corianton, who had repented and become a valiant servant of the Lord because of the words of his father and the softening of his own heart. Now, this almost sounds as if we could stop here, but the Come Follow Me program wants us to continue on to chapter 52, and I'm trying desperately to keep up with the course of study. The challenge for me is that there is so much interesting stuff in these pages that it's very hard to condense it all down into one podcast. And just imagine, I'm trying to condense an abridgment. Can you imagine how hard it must have been for Mormon as he worked to fulfill the Lord's command to abridge a full record? It must have been a monumental task, and I can only imagine the frustration that Mormon must have felt as he was forced to leave out interesting accounts that just didn't make the cut as to the things that we of this generation would need to know. Remember, his task was to find the stories and accounts that would be of most benefit to us in this day and age, and that would help us understand the events going on around us now by learning how those same events affected the people of his generations. This next chapter is a perfect example of that. As we begin chapter 46, we're going to meet a man named Amalickiah, an opportunistic and avaricious man who saw a chance for personal power and who let nothing stand in his way to get it. This may have been 2,000 years ago, but make no mistake, the lessons we can learn from this are just as valid today as they were then. And we don't have to look very hard to find the same kind of people today as was Amalickiah. The intrigue and the betrayal in these pages coming up are right out of Game of Thrones. The details seem written by Hollywood and could certainly make a compelling medieval tale. So let's take a look and see what we can learn from his story. As Helaman took control of the church, he appointed priests and teachers throughout all the land. But the people prospered and grew rich, and as they grew rich, they forgot that which allowed them to prosper, and so dissension arose among them. The last verse of chapter 45 says, "But they grew proud, being lifted up in their hearts because of their exceedingly great riches. Therefore they grew rich in their own eyes, and would not give heed to their words, to walk uprightly before God." And sadly, we all know what pride does. It goeth before the fall. So as we get into chapter 46, we begin a sad tale. "And it came to pass that as many as would not hearken to the words of Helaman and his brethren were gathered together against their brethren. And now behold, they were exceedingly wroth, insomuch that they were determined to slay them. Now the leader of those who were wroth against their brethren was a large and a strong man, and his name was Amalickiah. And Amalickiah was desirous to be king." Now let me just remind you, these are Nephites, not Lamanites here. And remember, kings had been done away with by Mosiah 19 years earlier, and the reign of the judges had taken their place. And it says, "And those people who were wroth were also desirous that he should be their king." And then listen to this. "And they were the greater part of them, the lower judges of the land, and they were seeking for power." This is only the 19th and the 20th years of the reign of the judges, and that's not very long for all this history to have unfolded. My, how things can change in just a very few years. And again, just like with all the other antichrists and ambitious men we have read about so far in the Book of Mormon, it was their power of speech that led away so many people. We read this, "And they had been led by the flatteries of Amalickiah. And also, and now there were many in the church who believed in the flattering words of Amalickiah. Therefore they dissented even from the church." We saw this with Korihor, and we saw it with Nahor. We saw this from Zeezrom before his conversion, and we even saw it from Alma the younger and the sons of Mosiah before their conversions. All these people had great power to lead people astray by their clever and flattering words. So Mormon interjects a few of his personal thoughts here. He steps outside of the narrator's role and gives his own observation. He says, "Thus we see how quick the children of men do forget the Lord their God, yea, how quick to do iniquity, and to be led away by the evil one. Yea, and we see the great wickedness one very wicked man can cause to take place among the children of men. Yea, we see that Amalickiah, because he was a man of cunning device and a man of many flattering words, that he led away the hearts of many people to do wickedly, yea, and to seek to destroy the church of God." Amalickiah's efforts caught the attention of Moroni, and he rallied his people around the title of liberty, a flag he had made from his own garment, and these people vowed to preserve liberty at all costs. And it turns out that Moroni's people outnumbered Amalickiah's people, and so we read, "And it came to pass that when Amalickiah saw the people of Moroni were more numerous than the Amalickiahites, he also saw that his people were doubtful concerning the justice of the cause in which they had undertaken. Therefore, fearing that he should not gain the point, he took those of his people who would, and departed into the land of Nephi." Remember, that was the base of the Lamanite kingdom. And Moroni knew that if Amalickiah's people joined with the Lamanites, that would only strengthen the Lamanite army and pose a greater threat to the Nephites. And he didn't want that to happen. So he took his army and he headed them off. It says, "He took his army and marched out with his tents into the wilderness to cut off the course of Amalickiah in the wilderness." Well, that worked for the most part, and Moroni was successful in stopping the main migration of the Amalickiahites towards the land of Nephi. But Amalickiah and a small number of his men escaped. It says, "And it came to pass that Amalickiah fled with a small number of his men, and the remainder were delivered up into the hands of Moroni, and were taken back to the land of Zarahemla." There Moroni gave those people the chance to repent, and we read, "And it came to pass that whomsoever of the Amalickiahites that would not enter into a covenant to support the cause of freedom, that they might maintain a free government, he caused to be put to death. And there were but few who denied the covenant of freedom." But as for Amalickiah, he was only just getting started, and here is where we really see the intrigue. He and those who still followed him did make their way to the land of Nephi and to the home of the Lamanites, and there he used his skills at flattery and cunning devices to stir up the Lamanites against the Nephites. He finally got the king of the land to issue a proclamation calling the people together in preparation for war with the Nephites. Now, this was a political move and nothing more, for most of the people were happy living with the peace agreement they had previously made with Moroni and the Nephites. Nevertheless, the king had spoken, and so we read, "And it came to pass that when the proclamation had gone forth among them, they were exceedingly afraid. Yea, they feared to displease the king, and they also feared to go to battle against the Nephites, lest they should lose their lives. And it came to pass that they would not, or the more part of them would not, obey the commandments of the king." I believe Amalickiah knew that this would be the outcome of the king's proclamation, and it played right into his hands. I think it was all part of his cunning plan. He convinced the king to put him in charge of his army so that he could, quote, "compel them to arms," close quote. The next verse even says this. "Now behold, this was the desire of Amalickiah, for he, being a very subtle man to do evil, therefore he laid a plan in his heart to dethrone the king of the Lamanites." See, doesn't that sound like Game of Thrones? Remember, all fiction is based in or inspired by fact and by real-life stories. Anyway, the Lamanites who had fled rather than be called up into battle had fled to a place called Onidah, and they had appointed a man to be their king and a leader over them, being fixed in their minds with a determined resolution that they would not be subjected to go against the Nephites. Remember, these were Lamanites now. They were, however, prepared to battle Amalickiah's men. They went up onto a mountain called Antipas, there to await whatever was to come. However, Amalickiah did not want to battle with them, even though that was sort of what he had been sent to do by the king. Rather, he wanted to gain their support and loyalty. To that end, he camped his men at the bottom of the hill and sent an emissary up to meet their king, a man named Lahontai. Amalickiah beckoned him to come down, but he would not, so Amalickiah sent another emissary up a second time, and even a third time. Finally, Lahontai and a few of his men met Amalickiah and a few of his men halfway up the hill, away from his gathered army below. Remember, those men below were loyal to the Lamanite king, and Amalickiah needed them to be loyal to him as their king rather than as their general. How many times has this story been played out through history, where a military leader wants to usurp the king or the Caesar or the great leader of the people? Anyway, Amalickiah devised a plan with Lahontai to have Lahontai's men come down in the middle of the night and surround Amalickiah's men. In return, Amalickiah would make Lahontai his second in command over the whole combined army. And the plan worked. We read, "And it came to pass that Lahontai came down with his men and surrounded the men of Amalickiah, so that before they awoke at the dawn of the day, they were surrounded by the armies of Lahontai. And it came to pass that when they saw that they were surrounded, they pled with Amalickiah that he would suffer them to fall in with their brethren, that they might not be destroyed. Now this was the very thing which Amalickiah desired. And it came to pass that he delivered his men, contrary to the commands of the king. Now this was the thing that Amalickiah desired, that he might accomplish his designs in dethroning the king." But Amalickiah's scheme was even more dastardly. He knew that should a king die, his second in command would be elevated to the position, and he feared that Lahontai might have designs of his own. So it says that, quote, Amalickiah caused that one of his servants should administer poison by degrees to Lahontai, that he died. How clever! Don't just up and kill him, or he might lose the support of Lahontai's people. But by simply making him sick, it could appear that it was just Lahontai's time to die, leaving Amalickiah as the head of all the combined armies. And his plan worked. It says, now when Lahontai was dead, the Lamanites appointed Amalickiah to be their leader and their chief commander. Once that was accomplished, Amalickiah marched his combined troops back to the land of Nephi to implement the next part of his plan. And it came to pass that Amalickiah marched with his armies to the land of Nephi, to the city of Nephi, which was the chief city. And the king came out to meet him with his guards, for he supposed that Amalickiah had fulfilled his commands, and that Amalickiah had gathered together so great an army to go against the Nephites to battle. And here is where Amalickiah's plan comes to completion. But behold, as the king came out to meet him, Amalickiah caused that his servants should go forth to meet the king. And they went and bowed themselves before the king, as if to reverence him because of his greatness. And it came to pass that the king put forth his hand to raise them, as was the custom with the Lamanites, as a token of peace, which custom they had taken from the Nephites. And it came to pass that when he had raised the first from the ground, behold, he stabbed the king to the heart, and he fell to the earth. But this alone would not have served Amalickiah well if the people thought he had had the king killed. However, the king's servants, seeing that he had been stabbed and killed, fled the scene, allowing the servants of Amalickiah to cry out, saying, Behold, the servants of the king have stabbed him to the heart, and he is fallen, and they have fled. Behold, come and see. As the people came forth and saw what had happened, they bought into Amalickiah's deception. And he took advantage of the situation, declaring that any who loved the king should go in pursuit of the servants and kill them. But the servants had fled quickly and disappeared into the wilderness. Amalickiah's army returned from hunting them without success. But no matter, Amalickiah's dastardly plan had worked, and he was proclaimed king by the people of the land of Nephi. As for the king's servants who had fled, they made their way to Zarahemla and ultimately joined the people of Ammon in Jershon. Back in the city of Nephi, Amalickiah had one more part of his plan to bring about. Let me just say, Amalickiah was a very bad guy, one of the worst we have encountered in the Book of Mormon so far. Anyway, back in Nephi, this is what happened. And now it came to pass that the queen, when she had heard that the king was slain, for Amalickiah had sent an embassy to the queen, informing her that the king had been slain by his servants, that he had pursued them with his army, but it was in vain, and they had made their escape. Therefore, when the queen had received this message, she sent unto Amalickiah, desiring him that he should come in unto her. And she also desired him that he should bring witnesses with him to testify concerning the death of the king. And it came to pass that Amalickiah took the same servant that slew the king, and all them that were with him, and went in unto the queen, unto the place where she sat, and they all testified unto her that the king was slain by his own servants. And they said also, They have fled. Doth not this testify against them? And thus they satisfied the queen concerning the death of the king. And it came to pass that Amalickiah sought the favor of the queen, and took her unto him to wife. And thus by his fraud and by the assistance of his cunning servants he obtained the kingdom. Yea, he was acknowledged king throughout the land. Now tell me, isn't that right out of Game of Thrones? By the way, this acknowledgement of his royalty came not just from Lamanites in the city of Nephi, but, as Mormon says, all the dissenters of the Nephites from the reign of Nephi down to the present time. And then at the end of this tale, Mormon includes his personal observation about those Nephite dissenters, which I think is most valuable. He says, "Now these dissenters, having the same instruction and the same information of the Nephites, yea, having been instructed in the same knowledge of the Lord, nevertheless, it is strange to relate, not long after their dissensions, they became more hardened and impenitent, and more wild, wicked, and ferocious than the Lamanites, drinking in with the tradition of the Lamanites, giving way to indolence and all manner of lasciviousness, yea, entirely forgetting the Lord their God." Well, as we continue the saga of Amalickiah, we see that he was not through with his effort to become king over all of the land, including the land of Zarahemla. And by the way, we're still just in the 19th year of the reign of Judges. A lot has happened in a relatively short time. It's been intense, but Moroni and the Nephites have used the time wisely to fortify their homes and cities. Knowing of Amalickiah's desire to take control of all the lands, Moroni has directed the building of earthen walls around all their cities. And these were apparently pretty significant because it says that the Lamanites were unable to cast their arrows and their stones over them to harm the Nephites. Remember the city of Amalickiah? We talked about that at length a while back. That was the city that had bound Ammon and Alma and made them watch as they burned the women and children of all the believers. As a result, their city had been sacked by the Lamanites the very next year, and every single person in the city had been killed. That was back in the 11th year of the reign of Judges, and the records say that the city stunk from the dead bodies and lay uninhabited for a number of years. Here, though, we read that the city was rebuilt, at least in part, and that Moroni had directed the Nephites to again build up a ridge of earth so high that the Lamanites could not reach them with their weapons. Moroni had done this knowing that the Lamanites had once before entered and destroyed the city of Amalickiah, and he assumed that they would attack it again, thinking the results would be the same. However, that was not to be. We read this. "Now at this time, the chief captains of the Lamanites were astonished exceedingly because of the wisdom of the Nephites in preparing their places of security." Now the Lamanites had supposed, because of the greatness of their numbers, yea, they supposed that they should be privileged to come upon them as they had hitherto done. Yea, they had also prepared themselves with shields and breastplates, and they had also prepared themselves with garments of skins, yea, very thick garments to cover their nakedness. But behold, to their uttermost astonishment, they were prepared for them in a manner which never had been known among the children of Lehi. When the Lamanites saw these fortifications, they gave up on Amalickiah, thinking they would go to other cities. But everywhere they went, they found that Moroni had built the same fortifications. Nevertheless, they were determined not to disappoint Amalickiah, and so they attacked and were slain with an immense slaughter. And we read, "Thus the Nephites had all the power over their enemies, and thus the Lamanites did attempt to destroy the Nephites until the chief captains were all slain. Yea, and more than 1,000 Lamanites were slain, while on the other hand there was not a single soul of the Nephites which was slain." Throughout all of this, the Lamanites were depending on their numbers and their strength, which made their defeat all the more bitter. But we see a great contrast between them and the Nephites. It says, "On the other hand, the people of Nephi did thank the Lord their God because of his matchless power in delivering them from the hands of their enemies." Notice that there was no boasting about the strength of their own armies or their cleverness in tactics. All thanks and glory were directed to their God in humility and their recognition that it was his hands that had protected them. So this is how the 19th year ended. And as we begin the 20th year, we see the Nephites building many more cities and prospering in the land. It says, "They prospered exceedingly, and they became exceedingly rich, and they did multiply and wax strong in the land." And then Mormon interjects again. He says, And thus we see how merciful and just are the dealings of the Lord to the fulfilling of all his words unto the children of men. And those who were faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord were delivered at all times. And then Mormon says this, "But behold, there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi since the days of Nephi than in the days of Moroni, yea, even at this time in the 21st year of the reign of the judges." Now I need to wrap this up, but there is much more fascinating history with Moroni and with Teancum and the dissenter Morianton, but I'm going to just encourage you to read that story yourself. That will be chapters 50 through 52. However, I will tell you that Amalickiah does meet his end in chapter 51. I just want to make this one point about what we've been listening to today. Many members wonder why there are so many stories about war in the Book of Mormon. There are, in fact, if my memory serves, 167 pages that deal with warfare. That is almost exactly 1/3 of the Book of Mormon. And in those stories, we find different settings and different troop strengths and different tactics. There are stories where the Nephites have the advantage in the number of soldiers, and there are times when the Lamanites have the advantage. But if you read carefully, you will see that the outcome of the battles was always dependent of the faithfulness of the Nephites to their Lord. It made no difference if they were the underdogs or the more superior power. In every battle, it came down to their faithfulness. So again, I repeat the verse I just read. And those who were faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord were delivered at all times. That should be one of the most powerful messages of the Book of Mormon to us every day. That same principle will reside with us as we face our battles. They may not be with sword and shield, although they may be, but in whatever challenge we face, we must remember the Lord as our arm of strength. If we do that, we cannot fail. I bear you my testimony of that principle in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Until next week, I'm Mark Swent. Thank you for listening.